Hi Year 12, so this is the last video looking at the historical notes on section in the Handmaid's Tale. We left off at the end of last lesson with this comment by Judd: our big mistake was teaching them to read. We won't do that again, and we're just going to go through the last few pages of the text before we get into looking at some of the themes and doing some work on essay writing. So it is Judd who's credited with devising the form as opposed to the name of the partisecution ceremony, arguing that it was not only a particularly horrifying and effective way of ridding yourselves of subversive elements, but it would also act as a steam valve for the female elements of Gilead. And so not only do we have this kind of casual acceptance of violence with Judd's character, this commander, one of the sons of Jacob, which they have identified might be the commander in Offred's household. We have this casual violence, particularly horrifying and effective way of ridding yourselves of subversive elements. So again, the partisecution ceremony that we saw Offred participate in, where a supposed rapist of pregnant handmaid was being executed through this kind of communal violence. But we also see here this suggestion that it is a steam valve for the female elements, and of course that's the handmaids of Gilead. And Pisotto goes on to say, scapegoats have been notoriously useful throughout history, and it must have been most gratifying, look at the use of that word, for these handmaids, so rigidly controlled at other times, to be able to tear a man apart with their bare hands every once in a while. And so not only do we have this seeming idea that Judd's character appears to be kind of completely comfortable with this overt violence, but this is also something that Pisotto, looking back on Gilead from a kind of space of 200 years of history, again has this kind of bizarre casual take on it. And so he suggests that it's gratifying, it's satisfying, pleasurable even, for these handmaids to tear a man apart with their bare hands every once in a while. And it's really important that you compare this comment to Offred's actual experience during the partisecution, and the kind of the description that she gives us of the other handmaids. You think about the mental and emotional toil that it has on Janine, for example. So popular and effective did this practice become that it was regularised in the Middle Period, when it took place 4 times a year on solstices and equinoxes. There are echoes here of the fertility rites of earth goddess cults, and so we see this as being almost like pagan sacrifices, which is what Pisotto is referring to here. That this act, this is a sacrifice almost, not only to so-called fertility gods, but also to appease the gods, the regime of Gilead. And so these individuals that are kind of killed in the partisecution are the scapegoats by which everybody's kind of sin is appeased and cleared. Gilead was, as we heard in the panel discussion yesterday afternoon, Gilead was, although undoubtedly patriarchal in form, occasionally matriarchal in content, like some sectors of the social fabric that gave rise to it. And so we have this idea of female dominant power structures, and of course the social fabric that gave rise to Gilead. One of the catalysts, or one of the ideas, is this sense of feminism, second wave feminism particularly, out of is another reason which means that Gilead was kind of rooted in. As the architects of Gilead knew, to institute an effective totalitarian regime, or indeed any system at all, you must offer some benefits and freedoms, at least to a privileged few, in return for those you remove. And so we have a replication here of the justification that the commander uses when he takes Offred to Jezebel's, and he kind of explains this idea for us already. And here we have the same justification being used as a kind of description of the perk that a handmaid might receive in being able to be involved in the participation. It's seen as being a benefit for everything that they have to give up. In this connection, a few comments upon the crack female control agency known as the aunts is perhaps in order. And again, we have a lovely, beautifully descriptive description of the aunts here. So the crack female control agency, and of course none of this is potentially inaccurate. We know that they are in control of the propaganda and the re-education, the indoctrination of the handmaids in the Rachel and Leah centres. We also know from Aunt Lydia's own mouth at both the salvaging and the participation that she is the mouthpiece of the regime. And so to a certain extent they are very much part of the control and the oppression, but here they're made to sound like a kind of a group of daring secret police or spies, this kind of crack agency. Judd, according to the Limpkin material, was of the opinion from the outset that the best and most cost-effective, lovely use of, again, that idea of value and women, cost-effective way to control women for reproductive and other purposes was through women themselves. For this there were many historical precedents. In fact, no empire imposed by force or otherwise has ever been without this feature, control of the indigenous by members of their own group. And so again, we have this lovely idea of segregation, you know, and it's absolutely true that, you know, the Roman Empire, for example, would co-opt, coerce local leaders into being their representatives with a kind of oversight from a Roman general at some kind of centre of power. And so we see this, it's interesting that the women here are being compared to a different ethnical group. And so we have this kind of this separation of gender that almost becomes a completely separate nationality. In the case of Gilead, there were many women willing to serve as aunts, either because of a genuine belief in what they called traditional values, and of course that's the moral majority, the right-wing kind of Christian, evangelical Christians that we see emerging. You think about all of the support for Ronald Reagan in his various elections, this sense of the return to the traditional housewife role for a woman, or for the benefits they might thereby acquire. Where power is scarce, a little of it is tempting. There was too a negative inducement. Childless or infertile or older women who were not married could take service in the aunts and thereby escape redundancy. And therefore redundancy means kind of a sort of a useless, pointless extra. The consequent shipment to the infamous colonies, which were composed of portable populations used mainly as expendable toxic cleanup squads, though if lucky you would be assigned to less hazardous tasks such as cotton picking and fruit harvesting. And here again we have this kind of a very astute but also quite sinister, quite ominous description of the various motivations for being an aunt in Gilead. This idea then was Judd's, but the implementation has the mark of Waterford on it. Who else among the sons of Jacob think tankers would have come up with the notion that the aunts should take names derived from commercial products available to women in the immediate pre-Gilead period, and thus familiar and reassuring to them, the names of cosmetic lines, cake mixes, frozen desserts, and even medicinal remedies. And we have, and he says it's a brilliant stroke. This amuses him, the idea that the aunts then, who are also renamed Aunt Elizabeth, Aunt Lydia, are given these names that are familiar to women from commercial products which have been taken away from them in the pre-Gilead era. And just an example then, kind of these female-centric brands that would have been around in the early 1980s, something like Elizabeth Arden. So it was a brilliant stroke and confirms us in our opinion that Waterford was, in his prime, a man of considerable ingenuity. So in a way was Judd, and we have this admiration and respect for these men who, again, through the lens of history, are being described as being ingenious, really clever tactic. Wow, that was great propaganda, without any understanding of the reality and the human tragedy. And I think as we read through the final bit of the Handmaid, the historical notes here, it's really worth taking the temperature as we hear more of Pisotto's voice and less of Offred's story, because we're not even, Atwood crafts this very carefully, that we don't even get any of the kind of personal details, the mentions of any of the specific events that are connected to our Offred. And so as we go through Pisotto's speech, it's very easy for us to warm to him as an audience and to begin to nod along with him and to begin to be engaged and interested in these facts and this information that he's sharing about Gilead. And isn't this giving us lots of really good things that we wanted to know about this regime? And we begin to make the mistake that Atwood is saying society makes with history and these kind of catastrophic events that take place not only in the ancient past 200 years ago, but also in the recent past and our contemporary times, which is that we begin to see it through the lens of almost a textbook, through the lens of information, rather than seeing the personal stories. So both of these gentlemen were known to have been childless and thus eligible for a succession of handmaids. Professor Wade and I have speculated in our joint paper, The Notion of Seed in Early Gilead. And again, we have this kind of this problematic, well, like, what is this paper about? Clearly it's about how the fertility problem in Gilead has been dealt with. So the notion of seed in Gilead, that both, like many of the commanders, had come into contact. And then there seems to be a hint that there's some kind of biological virus or biological weapon that's being created. So they seem to have come into contact with a sterility-causing virus that was developed by secret pre-Gilead gene splicing experiments with mumps, and which was intended for insertion into a supply of caviar used by top officials in Moscow. So we have this almost absurd kind of scenario that's created here, which is there's been some gene splicing, and they've managed to create something that is akin to the virus mumps and causes sterility among men. And that somehow this virus has been kind of created in a way that it can be placed into caviar, and it's going to be put with in the caviar of the top officials in Moscow, which is kind of very Cold War-esque. And what's interesting here is that there are continuous conspiracy theories about biological warfare and biological weapons. The idea that superpowers continue to keep samples of viruses that can be deadly, things like Ebola. And for anyone that, we're reading this in May 2020, when we are all at home because of a deadly virus. And so again, despite this being a slightly absurd event that could have happened, this is very much rooted in reality. The experiment was abandoned after the spheres of influence accords, because the virus was considered too uncontrollable and therefore too dangerous by many, though some wished to sprinkle it over India. And we have, again, ideas here about the kind of exponential population growth in Eastern countries like China and India. Again, we have some sense of racism here, but also this kind of very sinister idea of nation states being kind of actively involved in the destruction of other nation states. However, neither Judd nor Waterford was married to a woman who was or had ever been known as Pam or as Sarina Joy. The latter appears to have been a somewhat malicious invention by our author. And so the suggestion that the name given to this character, Sarina Joy, is a kind of ironic invention by Offred, because she is neither serene nor joyful. Judd's wife's name was Bambi Mae, and Waterford's was Thelma. And again, we have that kind of absurdity of this early Gileadian era, where we are transferring so many of the hallmarks of North American modern culture into Gilead. And so we have this woman who's called Bambi Mae. The latter, so that's Thelma, had once worked as a television personality of the type described. We know this from Limpkin, who makes several snide remarks about it. The regime itself took pains to cover up such former lapses from orthodoxy, which is the kind of the message that's been constructed by the spouses of its elites. And so here then we have this very strong indication that Waterford is our commander. And we'll just go on and have a look at some of the other things that are suggested about him. The evidence on the whole favours Waterford. We know, for instance, that he met his end, probably soon after the events our author describes, in one of the earliest purges. He was accused of liberal tendencies, of being in possession of a substantial unauthorised collection of heretical pictorial, so the magazines, and literary materials, and of harbouring a subversive. And so that would be a member of the resistance, and we wonder if this isn't Nick. This was before the regime began holding its trials in secret and was still televising them, which of course we know from the salvaging. And so again we get this insight into what happens in Gilead at a later period, that they are televising them as a form of kind of threat/propaganda. So the events were recorded in England via satellite and are on a videotape deposit in our archives. The shots of Waterford are not good, so he's been beaten. Think about the shots of the man that's brought out, the images of the man that's brought out for the particution. But they were clear enough to establish that his hair was indeed grey. And again, we have that very kind of idea of that brutality that comes, which is underplayed here in Pisotto's speech. You know, the thing that's recognisable about the body of Waterford is that he's grey-haired, which of course is what Offred describes. As for the subversive Waterford was accused of harbouring, this could have been Offred herself, as her flight would have placed her in that category. More likely it was Nick, who, by the evidence of the very existence of the tapes, must have helped Offred escape. And we get some conjecture here, explanation perhaps, of the very end of the text. It is interesting to note how quickly Pisotto dismisses Offred as a kind of significant enough to be labelled as the subversive that Waterford is deposed for harbouring, and that may be just because of her gender. It might be because of Nick's role, but you have to remember, if we think about Offglen, for example, and how much detailed information that she seemed to have about the May Day resistance, that it wasn't unusual for women to be very much at the heart of what the May Day Alliance was doing. And for him to dismiss her so quickly here again speaks of this kind of masculine focused history rather than a female interest in terms of her story. So he must have helped her to escape. The way in which he was able to do this marks him as a member of the shadowy May Day underground, which was not typical with identical with the underground female road, but had connections with it. The latter was purely a rescue operation, so that's what the underground female road is. It's purely for rescuing people. The former, the May Day resistance, was quasi-military. So this is we would call it paramilitary today. A number of May Day operatives were known to have infiltrated the Gileadian power structure at the highest levels, and the placement of one of their members as a chauffeur at Waterford would certainly have been a coup, a double coup, as Nick must have at the same time been a member of the Eyes, as a chauffeur and personal assistants often were. And so we see here that the benefit of having someone in the resistance infiltrating at this level means that Nick not only has access to all of the stuff that the commander has access to, but he also is then an eye and has access to the kind of the security and all of those things as well. Commanders were automatically directors of the Eyes. So hold on, I've missed out a bit here. So Waterford would have, of course, have been aware of this, but as all high-level commanders were automatically directors of the Eyes, he would not have paid a great deal of attention to it, would not have let it interfere with his infractions. And we've got the meetings with Offred, the going to Jezebel's, of which he would consider to be minor rules. Like most early Gileadian commanders who were later purged, he considered his position above attack. And I think it's really interesting here to consider this this idea of the stability of leadership and power. It's not arrogant if you have been a part of an architect of a society or the ideology around which a society is created. It isn't arrogant to assume that you would be afforded a measure of protection, a measure of admiration and respect. However, ideologies as opposed to power structures, and this is where Gilead, because they have the whole Gilead is within you, and the idea of the Christian faith that's had Gilead's own beliefs, the regime's own beliefs superimposed onto this faith. Ideologies' faith then often grow beyond an individual, a single person, and as humans are fallible and make poor choices, then they are no longer. It's very easy for them to become no longer integral to the running or the structure of an ideology. And so here he feels like he should be in a position that's above attack, above kind of justice. He isn't. And then Pisotto says the style of Middle Gilead was more cautious. And so we have this sense then that they've learned from their mistakes with people like Waterford. This is our guesswork. Supposing it to be correct, supposing that is that Waterford was indeed the commander, many gaps remain, and then we have his return to his irritation at Offred. Some of them could have been filled by our anonymous author. And it's, again, interesting how he never refers to her by her patronym. had she had a different turn of mind. So if she had been differently inclined, she would have given us more information. She could have told us much about the workings of the Gileadian Empire, had she had the instincts of a reporter or a spy. What we would not give now, even 20 pages or so of printout from Waterford's private computer. And so he had this irritation, and it does grate on the reader, where he appears to make this kind of moral judgment, this criticism of Offred, because she doesn't give the wider factual information that he wants about the regime. And her story then becomes negated, literally in need for his story, history. He would prefer to have had 20 pages of printout. Any 20 pages would have done from Waterford's private computer than her life story. And he says, however, we must be grateful for any crumbs the goddess of history has designed to vouchsafe us. And we have the irony here that the goddess of history, of course, is female, with him having this kind of endlessly desire for masculine definition of history. As for the ultimate fate of our narrator, it remains obscure. Was she smuggled over the border to Gilead into what was then Canada, and we get that revelation about the shifting geopolitics. And then did she make her way thence to England? This would have been wise, as the Canada of that time did not wish to antagonise its powerful neighbour, and there were roundups and extraditions of such refugees, and we have this kind of this criticism of the appeasement policies of liberal Canada. If so, why did she not take her taped narrative with her? Perhaps her journey was sudden, perhaps she feared interception. On the other hand, she may have been recaptured, and again we have this very casual references to what may have happened to her. She might have been captured. If indeed she did reach England, why did she not make her story public, as so many did upon reaching the outside world? She may have feared retaliation against Luke, supposing him still to be alive, which is an improbability, or even against her daughter, for the Gileadian regime was not above such measures, and used them to discourage adverse publicity in foreign countries. More than one incautious refugee was known to receive a hand, ear, or foot vacuum-packed express hidden in, for example, a tin of coffee. And again, it's just worth noticing whether our reactions have changed here. Again, this casual reference to the improbability of Luke surviving. And then we've got this kind of almost mob-esque, the kind of mafia-like description of the regime cutting off body parts from members of Gilead to send to refugees who've made it out, as a kind of sinister warning to keep quiet. Or perhaps she was among those escaped handmaids who had difficulty adjusting to life in the outside world once they got there, and after the protected existence they had led. Just think about how he describes a handmaid's life in Gilead as protected existence. She may become, like them, a recluse. We don't know. We can only deduce also the motivations for Nick's engineering of her escape. We can assume that once her companion Offred's association with Mayday had been discovered, he himself was in some jeopardy, for he as well knew, as a member of the Eyes, that Offred herself was certain to be interrogated. The penalties for unauthorised sexual activity with a handmaid were severe, and nor would his status as an Eye necessarily protect him. Gilead society was Byzantine in the extreme, and any transgressions might be used against one or one's undeclared enemies within the regime. So, to be Byzantine or Byzantine is this idea of a society that's despotic, devious, deceptive, it's secretive and malicious. And so we have kind of these complexities. So Nick, he could, of course, have assassinated her himself. Again, look at this kind of this casual, pragmatic callous, which might have been the wiser course. But the human heart remains a factor, and as we know, both of them thought she might be pregnant by him. And he has this kind of idealised romantic view of Nick the hero. What male of the Gilead period could resist the possibility of fatherhood, so redolent of status, so highly prized? Instead, he called a rescue team of eyes who may or may not have been authentic, but in any case were under his orders. In doing so, he may well have brought about his own downfall. This too we shall never know. And of course that is a great possibility, and again kind of gives him this romantic idea. Did our narrator reach the outside world safely and build a new life for herself? Or was she discovered in her attic hiding place, arrested, sent to the colonies or to Jezebel, or even executed? And again, Atwood here just drawing parallels with the Diary of Anne Frank. Our document, again, this kind of casual, callous, scientific, clinical, academic, though in its own way eloquent, is on these subjects mute. And again, he appears to reduce in its own way eloquent. It's not eloquent on the subjects that he wants it to be vocal on, it's mute. We may call Eurydice forth from the world of the dead, but we cannot make her answer. Eurydice was a Greek goddess, the wife of Orpheus, and she dies by being bitten by a viper. And he attempts to call her back from the underworld by playing beautiful music. And in one story, he calls her back and she appears before him. And as he goes to reach for her, to embrace her, Eurydice kind of disappears almost into mist, like smoke, like a ghost. And we have this kind of reference here that we can call her forth, but we can't make her answer. And when we turn to look at her, we glimpse her only for a moment before she slips from our grasp and flees. As all historians know, the past is a great darkness and filled with echoes. Voices may reach us from it, but what they say to us is imbued with obscurity of the matrix out of which they come. And, try as we may, we cannot always decipher them precisely in the clearer light of our own day. And so we have this really interesting reference, because he talks about Eurydice here as a female, and appears to suggest then that this idea that history is female, and we have to be aware then that we begin to warm to him, we begin to believe him. And he talks about history as a matrix out of which we are all born, and yet history, although often dominated by men, leaves women at the roots, the place that people are born out of, at the heart of history, but they continue to be a mystery. And so we have this applause and then this great irony: are there any questions? And of course, if we were being completely unkind to Professor Pisotto, we would say we are now filled with more questions than before, because all you've done is create conjecture and assumption, and you've not given us any revelation into anything to do with Offred's actual life. You know, did she survive? Did Nick survive? Is Luke still alive? What's happened to her daughter? What's happened to Moira? You know, all of those things that we're so desperate, those personal connections. But it's interesting to note that actually often when we consider, are there any questions, the questions that the reader wants to ask at the end of the text are questions about the regime, because Pisotto has done the thing that history does, which is to create the disconnection from Offred's personal narrative. And again, as we talked about in the first video, this is the heart of Atwood's purpose, that she is challenging us to be very careful about how we look at history, how we create meaning from history, how we find truth in history, and then to be very cautious about how we learn from history, and to ask ourselves if we do learn from history, or if we aren't just perhaps a little bit too much like Pisotto, in that we have this kind of textbook engagement and interest with history, which is all focused around facts and information, and not necessarily thinking about the human tragedies, the personal stories, and how we can learn from those. And that's where I'm going to leave this video for today.